Hi there, we're going to start taking a look at Chapter 19, specifically through the use of an extraordinary PowerPoint from Miss Susan Posier from Chappaqua in New York. Now, Chapter 19 talks about a lot of different factors. One is the imbalance that's created through industrialization, urbanization, and immigration, and the greater wealth inequities that come out of that. We also begin to see that the politics of the period is divided between those politics at the national level, which we'll examine here tonight, which are relatively passive and benign, versus those at the local and state levels that involve more controversial and divisive issues. And finally, we take a look at the beginnings of the reform movements and the populist party. Okay, so let's take a look first at what Ms. Posier calls the politics of equilibrium. And obviously, since it's in quotes, you can infer that there is something more to the meaning here, or perhaps something less to the definition of equilibrium. So, if we take a look at the Gilded Age politics from a two-party point of view, one of the things that we notice here, if we take a look at the elections from 1876 to 1892, is the states that vote Republican 4 or 5 times in a row are mostly in the Northeast and Midwest. Those who vote Democratic 4 or 5 times during this period are mostly in the South. And those who are irregular are the swing states of California, Nevada, Indiana, New York. So let's take a look at a couple of factors here. First, one thing that we can see is very painfully obvious is that after Reconstruction, we still see a somewhat north-south divide in the two political parties. It's not surprising that the South remains Democratic, especially since the Union Army, after it left in 1877, which was a Republican army, removed itself from the Reconstruction process. So it would seem kind of a defensive alignment that the South would remain Democratic. We also know that the Republican states not only were the Union Army states, but they were the ones that held the greatest sway in as far as the Industrial Revolution was concerned, with the exception of New York State, which of course has an extremely large and growing immigrant population. So, one political cartoon that describes this is Uncle Sam here in his pinstriped pants at a county fair, and he's weighing the Democrats and the Republicans and seeing that they are fairly balanced. Now, you can draw your own inferences from this political cartoon. It seems almost as if Uncle Sam might be trying to sell one or more of these chickens to a potential buyer. So, if we take a look at the political participation during this period, we see that by examining this chart, there is a great deal of voter loyalty to the two major political parties. And partly that's the result of, a settling of the political system, especially as more and more immigrants are beginning to settle into American society. I think it's important to take a look at the questions that this chart brings up, and that is, who is within each one of these blocks, who makes up a great deal of voting population during this time. Ask yourself also the question of why voting participation declines from 1876 all the way to 1920. And this is a broader topic that we've talked about in class, but I think it's an important one to introduce here. And that is democracy defined by participation in politics, or is democracy non-participatory and in that sense, a privilege. Um, so those questions are ones that I hope you would answer, and we'll discuss those further in class. But the more basic, simple question here is, what is the source of this voter loyalty? Is it, for instance, the intransigence of the North and the South to change political parties? Is it, for instance, the large shifting demographics as more immigrants are coming into the country? Or are there some other ideological issues going on within the political party platforms? So let's take a look at who makes up the Democratic bloc. Well, one thing we know is that um, there are definitely white Southerners, okay, there. And that remains true all the way through up until the Civil Rights era, and even including the Civil Rights era, with Southern segregationist Democrats known as Dixiecrats. We know that Catholics, by and far, make up the Democratic Party. This is also true for many recent immigrants who are arriving into the country, partly because of the party bosses that ran large urban areas, but also because um, the Democratic bloc did appeal to the urban working poor. This was an effort by many unions and other organizations to create their own base. And finally, we know that farmers are involved in the Democratic Party. We'll see later during this chapter that they begin to identify not just simply with the Democrats themselves, but with a different ideological platform. So, who makes up the Republicans? Well, the Republicans are mostly northern whites. We know that African Americans who uh, became ex-slaves, okay, the freedmen share an intense loyalty to the Republican Party, okay. We know that the Republican Party is made up of a lot of Protestants as compared to Catholics. As we point out here earlier, the Republican Party is heavily pro-business, and we know that there is a lot of nativist support for the Republicans. And in this sense, WASP stands for White, Anglo-Saxon, and Protestant. Okay, many of them did have support for anti-immigrant laws as compared to the immigrants who make up the Democratic Party. And finally, a lot of the middle class is also made up of the Republican bloc. So let's take a look at how these people vote and what they actually stand for. And we're going to begin by taking a look at the economic policies. So from 1870 to 1900, the government did very little domestically. This is actually true from the size of the federal government to the domestic policies during this period. We know that Western settlement continues, but as far as domestic politics from a national or federal level, they are very low. Now, let's take a look at some of the duties of the federal government during this period. 1. Deliver the mail. 2. Maintain a national military. 3. Collect tariffs and taxes. And 4. Conduct a foreign policy. The exception to this was giving out Civil War veterans' pensions. But those were the main duties of the federal government, which does not show much there. As far as the presidency, it was mostly seen as a symbolic office. We know that there are many weak executives that take um, the West Wing of the White House during this period. We know also, though, that party bosses did rule both in the Republican and in the Democratic parties. One of the most infamous or famous is Senator Roscoe Conkling, who maintained intense party loyalty, but with a heavy hand in patronage. And we'll talk about that when we get into civil service. So, presidents, according to this period, believed that they should avoid offending any factions within their own party. This is mostly true of the Republicans, who had a factional breakout during this period. We'll talk a little bit more about that in the next couple slides. Um, So the president gave out federal jobs. 30,000 people were working for the federal government at the end of the Civil War, but by 1890 we see that that number has more than tripled. So let's ask ourselves about the role of federal government here. If we see that there are just four main political duties during this period, why are so many people working? Well, if we begin to take a look at the government as simply a function of a political system, then it seems to make sense that the only job of the federal government is to protect the interests of the people, and that would be structurally mandated in the Constitution. If, however, the government's role was not simply to fulfill its functions, but to adapt to changing circumstances, then as the country grows and as certain conditions change, then the government would have to adjust to that as well. And those are two different views of the functions of government. So let's take a look at how the Republican Party actually breaks up into two different groups, and each has their own political leader. On one hand, we had the half-breeds. They were led mostly by James Blaine, and the Stalwarts. They were led mostly by Roscoe Conkling. Both of these are senators, New York and Maine. Notice the heavy New England presence. And let's take a look here. There are two presidents, one James Garfield, and the second his vice president, Chester Arthur. Of course, Chester Arthur takes over when James Garfield is assassinated. The main difference between these two groups is the position of civil service. Okay, and we notice that there is somewhat of a compromise here suggested by James Garfield, but of course, when when James Garfield's assassin did the deed, he shouted that he did it for Chester Arthur and that he was a diehard stalwart. So let's begin to take a look at the presidential elections. One, we have James Garfield and Chester Arthur, and two, we have on the Democratic side Winfield Hancock and William English. Now, it's interesting that both are James Garfield and Winfield Hancock are both Civil War leaders. Now, let's take a look at this political cartoon. We can tell here that the United States, particularly the North and the South, is ingloriously demonstrated to be basically a donkey that has two buttocks. That would be the North and the South. We can see here that General Hancock is approaching, and he's having to make a choice. Okay, and that is, does he support the South or the North? Of course, let's take a look at how that vote plays out. So we have the Republicans as blue and the Democrats as red. Okay, and we see that Garfield does win the elections, specifically in the electoral vote. Now, we're going to take a look at these presidential elections over time and notice how the country's electoral map changes during this period. But first, let's take a look at what happens right after the presidential election, and that is that President Garfield is elected and his assassin shouts out, I am a stalwart, and Arthur is president now. There are a couple interesting facts about the assassination. One is that it was the second assassination of a president. We have had 4 assassinations: President Lincoln, President Garfield, President McKinley, and President Kennedy. And we're going to end here and pick up when Chester Arthur becomes president in the next section.